The Americas and the New World: Persuasion, Indoctrination of Native Cultures of the Americas by the Europeans. Lecture terms. In the last lecture, we spoke a great deal about Spain and the New World, but we focused primarily on their Caribbean territories. After establishing a base of operations in the Caribbean at Cuba, future expeditions that would delve more deeply into Central and South America would be launched from that point. Cortez, in 1519, will be one of the most notorious of the conquistadors to explore Central America. Conquistadors were Spanish explorers, but they were also conquerors. Cortez heard rumors about an empire in Mexico, Central America, that was flowing with gold and riches. He set out from Cuba with 600 men and several dozen horses to try to establish control on the mainland. Once they arrived on the mainland in Central America, he ordered that his ships be burned so none of his men could mutiny. The head of the Aztec Empire was the great Montezuma. He sent word that Cortez should leave. He had received a prophecy from one of his soothsayers about a god that would come and conquer, and this frightened him. He sent a gift of gold to coax him away to leave. And this was, of course, the wrong thing to do for a man who wanted gold. This just whetted Cortez's appetite for that gold. Now, Montezuma was the head of the Aztec Empire, and an empire means from a central kingdom, more territories around are controlled. Montezuma was a fierce warrior, and the Aztecs were known as very ruthless people. They had conquered all of the areas around their capital city at Tenochtitlan, and they will maintain control of that empire through force and intimidation, oftentimes using prisoners of war from those that they conquered for their ritual sacrifices. Over time, a great number of those people will become weary of Aztec rule. That is one of the ways that Cortez will be able to conquer the Aztec Empire. He will ally with some of the subject peoples who had grown weary of Aztec rule, giving them promises of freedom that he will never keep. His 600 men grew to thousands of men overnight with this, and eventually he will be able to conquer the mighty Aztecs. He also will be able to be successful because of his secret weapon that he really didn't even understand: disease. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, smallpox in particular was extremely devastating on the native populations, and eventually a great deal of the natives will perish due to that disease. Pizarro was another notorious conquistador. In the 1530s, he will move into Peru on the Pacific coastline of South America to conquer the mighty Incan Empire. One of the most glamorous cities that the Incans had built was at Machu Picchu. He will be able to quickly take this city and continue to move throughout the Incan territories. With 200 men and a few dozen horses, and his use of treachery and murder, he will finally be able to force the Incans to capitulate. Pizarro exploited the differences among the native Incans. He will eventually capture the leader Atahualpa, and he will make a bargain for a payoff for his release. When he receives the silver from the people, he murdered the king anyways and claimed the entire territory for Spain. The silver mining from this region will be very profitable for the Spanish king. There's another thing that needs to be discussed. what to do between the Portuguese and the Spanish with these new empires that are being established. The Spanish still wanted to get some territories that would get them closer to India. And after the initial findings of Columbus in 1492, they appealed to the Pope to help them resolve an argument that they had with the Portuguese over who would be able to explore what territories. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed with Portugal, where a line of demarcation was drawn. If you see the map that I have displayed here, you will see where the line was drawn. The Portuguese had started to push into the Atlantic to find new routes to Asia as well. And they had landed on the coastline of South America, the Atlantic coastline. And so that's why the line was drawn in 1494, where you see it here. This is why the Portuguese will establish a base of operations in Brazil, and still to this day why Brazil speaks Portuguese and the rest of South America speaks Spanish. The Spanish, with the treaty, were able to explore anything west of the line, whereas the Portuguese were able to explore anything east of the line. Christian missionaries in the Americas. Christian missionaries were oftentimes used by the nations that were expanding into the New World to help them maintain a position in that area with the native population. Many of the Christian missionaries that came over to the Americas were sent to pacify the natives. Oftentimes, the Christian message worked to their advantage in that way. The Christian message with the tradition of turning the other cheek, is a very passive religion, worked for the Europeans. The Christian missionaries that were sent over would eventually, after the area was conquered, serve a dual purpose. Not only were they there to convert and pacify the natives, but as the governing forces come in and establish themselves, they would act as reinforcements for those civil administrators, oftentimes becoming civil administrators themselves. Northern European colonies in North America. As I stated before, the Spanish did not push too far north into North America. They did not think the climate was good. So beyond what you see here on this map in the blue, with modern-day Florida and Texas, and if the map went further over California, they stayed pretty much in Central and South America. The North American territories were left for other Northern European countries. In particular, the British and the French had started to send folks to the New World in North America by the time we get to the 1600s. Most of these Northern European nations were more interested in colonial settlements, and these settlements were less tied to royal control than the Spanish and the Portuguese territories that had been established. However, the reason why is because many of them were funded by joint stock company funds instead of by royal revenues. Therefore, the colonies established in these territories had more freedom of governing themselves than we saw with the Spanish settlements in particular. The fur trade is what attracted the French and the Dutch to North America. Natives trapped and traded pelts for European manufactured goods like wool textiles and firearms. But over time, more and more French and Dutch trappers came to North America, and there was further encroachment of the tribal hunting grounds. This will eventually pit rival native groups against one another, with Europeans ultimately being the beneficiaries. They would play one tribe off against another. The British in particular, but also some of the French, will focus on colonizing some of the territories along the coastline to establish cash crops that could be grown and then sent back to Europe. Tobacco was a big one. Just like it had been a big crop for the Caribbean, tobacco, once introduced to the Europeans, became very popular. The demand was high, so it became a very important crop. And the British, after settling in Virginia and South Carolina in particular, found that the soil was very conducive to the growth of tobacco. There will be other cash crops that will come along later as well, including cotton. How are they going to work these fields? Well, in some cases, some of the native population would be utilized, but primarily indentured servants would be used. Folks would indenture themselves to work a number of years to pay for their passage across the ocean to establish a new life for themselves. They would agree to work for a certain number of years for the owners of the joint stock company or the owners of the land, and then they would eventually be free after X amount of years to establish themselves in their own little piece of land. As there was more and more demand for tobacco and other cash crops, however, the indentured servants were not numerous enough to keep up with that demand. So eventually, the British and the French started to import African slaves into North America. In the long run, the African slaves were cheaper in the long run than indentured servants because you purchased them for life. Their work did not expire after a certain number of years. What about the relations with the natives? The Northern Europeans did not find the natives in North America organized into great centralized states or empires like the Spanish and the Portuguese had found in Central and South America. Instead, the tribes were mostly nomadic that would follow the herds from place to place, and they were not organized into any unified group. Oftentimes they fought against one another, and that's one of the reasons why the French in particular were able to pit one tribe against another to exploit the territories where they found good fur trapping. Eventually, the Northern European settlements would start to push the nomadic natives off of their hunting grounds when they found that these grounds proved to be fertile for the cash crops they were planting. The natives were forced to sign treaties giving rights to the colonists to occupy those lands. The problem was the natives did not understand what they were agreeing to. They were losing their hunting grounds for a mere pittance of payment, oftentimes beads or something of little value. Eventually, the natives will start to fight back, and this will lead to a great deal of warfare between the European settlers, and the native populations. This will cause more and more trouble as we move deeper into the history of North America, which we will discuss in a later lecture.